So successful testing also requires us in journalism to define diversity more broadly, gender and racial and ethnic diversity, and other underrepresented groups. How could we create a signal to let our users know that a news source was striving to tell the full story?
Unfortunately, managers tend to hire who they're comfortable with, and as a result of it, we have a lot of newsrooms that are just not very diverse. And it's not just by ethnicity, you also have not diverse by upbringing, by military background, or exposure to military lifestyle, especially after 9/11, we should have a little bit more encompassing in that. By mental health. A lot of things we're just not as diverse on as we like to, but you know that managers are just picking who they deem and feel comfortable to be in that environment. As a result, the news judgment reflects the people who are making the decisions. And if you have the same monolithic group at the table, then you're not going to have a lot of diverse voices or opinions happening here. So that's when you run into the issues of like, okay, why is a newsroom or why does news coverage look extremely left or right? It's because they only invited people to the table that feel that way or can agree that this is how we're going to cover the news in this newsroom.
Well, I think when we talk about diversity is a very difficult subject. As the president of AJA, what I learned is, sometimes when we talk about diversity, it becomes about the difference between people and rather about what is our common value and shared goals. So it became very much a checkbox system, where it's white versus black, men versus women, us versus them, technologists, people with technical skills to people who doesn't have technical skills. Right? So when we think about newsroom diversity, just by the virtue of wanting to make sure that there is, we create these silos where I would like for us, and this is something that AJA and I'm working on in terms of how do we reframe the conversation to be about share value, share goals. How do we define that same outcome, but acknowledge that there's different paths to the outcome because of our cultural differences?
I mean, I think it would be really strange if you spoke to journalists of color and they said they'd never experienced a stereotype in the newsroom. I think one of the things that Asians often face are not just stereotypes, but even the concept of being a minority. And so people often, I think that's actually oftentimes the racism that happens with Asians, is that people don't even see you as a minority. And there are a lot of stereotypes about Asians that I haven't necessarily had personally, but I think it's sort of this notion of either a model minority or a terrorist, right? And that's kind of what happens when people think about Asians. Personally, for me in newsrooms, it's a lot more in the form of, I am the vice president of broadcast for the Asian American Journalists Association, and our convention a couple months ago chaired a panel that was like, no, that's the other Asian. And had the fact that oftentimes if there's for example for me, another Indian in the newsroom, people confuse us. That happened to me all the time. It still happens. And so that was part of a conversation we had that led to a lot of discussions about how Asians experience sort of microaggressions in the workplace. And I think one of them is often a very simple thing of not even looking at people and assuming it's the other person.
I mean, I hate saying we need mandates, but it seems like when I went into college and, all the talk about the late 90s was that diversity was really important, but I came out of school and 9/11 happened and no one cared about diversity all of a sudden anymore. So we've gone from there and never came back to the whole diversity conversation, and folks have deemed it to not be necessary. I feel it still is necessary, and we're seeing more and more of this as the public starts to kind of like snap back and say, I'm not looking at certain websites, I'm not watching certain newscasts, I'm not listening to certain radio, whatever shows. They're telling you that they don't like it and they're voting with their feet and leaving us. So if you don't want your audience to stick around and continue down the same path of monolithic, crappy reporting that no one is embracing. But if you want to get the audience, if you want to get the audience engaged, you want them to come back, you want them to be loyal, then you need to give them a product that reflects what they want to hear and also what is necessarily important to their communities. And if you can't get that, I don't think you can get that through a newsroom that looks all carbon copy the same. We are a melting pot culture. We have so many people from vast different backgrounds, and they shape our narrative here in the United States. But if they're not writing our narrative here in the United States, then whose story are you really telling when you do these reports?
And I think certainly no one's going to say that newsrooms reflect the communities they serve. And until newsrooms look like the communities that they're serving, they're not going to be diverse newsrooms.
I think the next step is really about the outreach from both communities. Right? We have a lot to learn and we have a lot to share. So how do we share this in a way that's inviting and not be, it's sort of like we're invited to a party, but I don't want to just be invited to a party. I want to be invited to dance and participate. And it needs to go both ways. So how do we actually, from both communities, take a more active role in participation?